G'day everyone and welcome to the Trekzone Spotlight. Today's guest last joined me in February to chat about Axanar. His name, of course, is Carlos Pedraza from axamonitor.com. Today we'll be chatting about Axanar once again as they've been in our headlines over the last week. Carlos is on the line now from LA joining me. Carlos, thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Mate, you are looking absolutely fantastic and very clean shaven today. I appreciate that.
Well, you know, only the best for you, Matt.
Mate, now let's get started. First of all, there's been a little bit of a discussion online in regards to the official Axanar podcast. They're on a platform called Trek FM, good friends of Trekzone. Can you give us a little bit of background on how on where this has all come about, do you think?
Sure. I mean, for Trek FM, the Axanar podcast was a great addition back in the days when Axanar was a hot property, as it were, when it was coming off the success of Prelude to Axanar, and the actors it had involved, and it was getting a lot of attention and having a lot of success in its crowdfunding efforts. All of those things were a great thing. And for Trek FM to adopt the Axanar podcast or establish the Axanar podcast was a smart move. But of course, we've come a long way since then, and things have changed. And I think even they have to admit that.
Yeah, well, I've been chatting to Chris for the last couple of days, and he's asked me to convey a statement on his behalf, which reads, when the podcast started, Axanar was a normal project, just like any of the numerous fan projects over the years. As the amount of money being raised grew, it was interesting from a business and technology standpoint, an indication of how crowdsourcing was evolving and how it might change the possibilities for creative professionals. As a strong proponent of podcasting and as someone who created the network and its many shows in part for the purpose of interviewing those who had worked on Star Trek over the years to preserve the details and memories of how it all came together, naturally the idea was interesting to me. Few, if any, film projects had been covered in this manner as they unfolded. It'd be a great demonstration of the power of podcasting. That was then. Things have changed. The situation between Axanar and CBS has been well documented and was settled in court. I've personally been away from it all for years, long before the lawsuit even came up. I have much bigger, very serious issues in my life related to health and family to worry about, like trying to save my eyesight. Now, as I said, Trek FM, Chris are very good friends of Trekzone, and those are some pretty serious health concerns that he is going through. What do you make of that statement, Carlos?
Well, I mean, I can't disagree with any of it. I think that the history of the Axanar podcast has been very good for Trek FM, but I think as time has moved on and we've seen a lot of revelations in court documents, and we've seen the lack of accountability and transparency in it, it has become an increasingly controversial project to continue to support. And make no mistake, Trek FM is supporting Axanar in all of its unaccountable glory, I guess, because they're providing a platform for it to continue to propound its point of view, and tell people things are happening that aren't happening, and I think it's reached a point where it's basically just sort of a propaganda outlet, and I think that podcasts, and I'm a big proponent of podcasting. Podcasts are best when they're actually about an exchange of ideas. And if the Axanar podcast was about that and about confronting some of the issues around fan films and copyright and what's gone wrong with Axanar after nearly $2 million raised and no movie made, then yes, I think that it would be great to have a platform for that kind of examination, those kinds of open discussions, and civil discussions, which sometimes is lacking around this topic. But that can be done, and unfortunately, what it has become is sort of a one-sided outlet about all these great things that are happening at Axanar that actually aren't really happening, or are taking a long time, or will cost even more money. And those are the kinds of issues people deserve to know about, because he's going to be coming back to them for money and for other projects for money. The settlement prevents Axanar from crowdfunding for the 2 Axanar short films, but not for any future projects. So future Star Trek related projects, if they're going to have them, and at this point they're saying they're not, but a few months ago they were saying they were, so who knows what they're going to be saying a few months from now. But they're bound under the guidelines for any future Star Trek projects, but for other fan films, for other, commercial projects that they're working on themselves through their new for-profit RocketWorks company, those things, people deserve to know what the history and background and accountability and transparency, or lack thereof, is associated with this project, with this production company, with these personnel, before they're going to be asked to hand over money to them.
Do you think, though, that Trek FM is more like a platform for Axanar, like YouTube is, or even their website? I mean, Alec writes captain's logs on the Axanar website. Do you see Trek FM as more of a platform rather than a network of shows which include Axanar? So what I'm trying to say here is that there's no real sort of official endorsement, and I know that the Trek FM logo has been dropped from the artwork of the podcast. So is it more of a platform like YouTube and a website, or do you think that it is a network show?
Well, it's somewhere in between. I mean, a lot of Trek FM's podcasts are made by independent producers, and Trek FM provides a platform for them, so it is definitely a platform. But is it the Wild West like YouTube is? No, it's not. It is curated. They decide which programs get that stamp, that Trek FM stamp and logo on them. So they're curated. They provide an imprimatur of legitimacy to each of the podcasts that is broadcast under their banner. Consequently, I believe that brings a certain amount of responsibility onto them about the programs that they promote under their banner, and whether those programs in fact represent ideas or projects that behave ethically, that are open to discussion, that people deserve to know about.
Well, look, I am hoping to hear from Chris soon. He is contemplating the Axanar podcast, but of course, given everything going on in his life, it is not a high priority. So, at this stage, I think that it is that we should recognise it for what it is, and the fact that it's been there for so long, and it was there when Axanar was a legitimate production, and that's, I guess, where podcasts like this one and your website, Carlos, come in to sort of counter the narrative that they're so freely allowed to talk about through their captain's logs and the podcast.
Sure. I mean, I think the idea behind AxaMonitor is to ask questions, and unfortunately, those are questions that Axanar and Alec Peters haven't been willing to really address head on. They kind of step around them and use their podcasts to try to preempt those questions or deflect from those questions. They're valid questions. People want to know and deserve to know, where did this money go? Why didn't it go to what we thought it was going to go? Why is it taking so long? Why was it spent one way versus another? Why do you say you're transparent and accountable when you're refusing to answer these very simple questions? The act of asking those questions has become the reason why people have been booted from Facebook groups that Axanar controls. It's the reason why former donors have now become opponents of the program. It's why former donors have had their donation reimbursed in order to prevent them from being able to ask these questions on the crowdfunding platforms that Axanar used to raise that money on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, where there are discussion forums there, and people have asked what's going on and what's happened to the money, and rather than address those questions forthrightly and honestly, he refunds them through Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and they lose their privilege to ask, to post questions on those discussion threads, and they go silent.
All right, well, let's move on, because something else happened at the weekend at a little convention called Dragon Con.
A little one. It's a tiny little convention.
There was a table set up there. Tell us what happened.
Well, Dragon Con is it's a fan-run convention, and I believe still the largest fan-run convention in the United States. Consequently, they obviously have a dealer's room and exhibition hall where people pay money to sell things and have prime space in those halls that the tens of thousands of people who attend Dragon Con wander back and forth, looking at what people have. You get the privilege of selling products there, promoting your projects and so forth, which is great. On top of that, Dragon Con is generous enough to provide free tables for fans that are promoting a fan club or their fandom, and they allow them to sell branded logos of products that are branded with the fan club's name. But no other merchandise. And they don't even allow people at those tables to raise money for charity, because Dragon Con has official charities, and they want to make sure that that's the only charities that are supported by Dragon Con, by having a presence at Dragon Con. So several months ago, Alec Peters announced that he was going to spin off a lot of Axanar's operations into so-called Axanar fan groups, and they were supposed to be sort of regionally organized, and one of them is organized in the Atlanta area, where Alec Peters and Axanar Productions moved this year. And so the Axanar fan group supposedly asked for and received a table at Dragon Con to promote their fan club. But when you actually looked at what was being promoted there, you did not see any kind of a banner saying Axanar fan group or fan club. You saw the same old Axanar, collateral PR images, banners, that you saw, over the last several years at conventions that Alec Peters attended and was raising money for Axanar. Money, by the way, that has never been accounted for. But in this instance, this table was being manned by volunteers from the Atlanta area, and but it was using images of the actors that appeared in Prelude to Axanar to advertise itself and to advertise the things that it was selling. And it was not selling anything that said Axanar Fan Group on it. What it was selling was Axanar patches, and they were, one of which was supposedly raising money for animal charities. Both those things go against the rules that Dragon Con has for these fan tables. There was the Axanar brand all over it. And in addition, their banner had the actor Tony Todd's image on it. And he walked away from Axanar 2 years ago, in fact, 2 years ago to the day of Dragon Con, and his concern was about the lack of accountability for the crowd funds that Axanar was using, and the repeated delays in production and getting Axanar made. And so he was pretty quiet about it until around the time of the lawsuit, when he finally said, I'm not associated with, he posted on Twitter, I'm not associated with this anymore because I have serious concerns. And, Alec Peters retaliated and said he couldn't read, and that he was asking for some astronomical amount of money in order to appear. And of course, we have no documentation of that. And it seems much more likely that, in fact, the concerns Tony Todd had were legitimate ones and were never answered by Alec Peters or anyone at Axanar Productions. Consequently, he has allowed his image to be continued to be used in connection with promoting Prelude to Axanar, because he signed to do that, and Prelude is a finished project that he worked on, so it's reasonable to expect his image to be still used in promoting Prelude to Axanar. But the Axanar film itself, the feature and now the 2 short films that are allowed under the lawsuit settlement, you're not allowed to use his image to promote those things. And so when he found out that his image was being used at this so-called fan table at DragonCon, he tweeted that he had nothing to do with Axanar, wanted nothing to do with Axanar, would never be associated with Axanar, and he wanted his image taken down. So between those 2 things, his complaints about his image being used without authorization and merchandise being sold at a fan table where merchandise was not supposed to be sold, DragonCon appears to have shut them down by the Sunday of that weekend, and they were gone.
It really sounds like that once the marketing materials were created for Prelude, that was it. For whatever reason, Alec hasn't bothered to create anything else, and they just kept trotting those out at random events. Now, you said that he's spun off the fan elements of Axanar. Why does a fan production, a Star Trek fan production, need to spin off anything? Why can't they just make the movie?
Well, that's a really good question. The thing is that when he announced this spin-off, one of the reasons he said was for liability purposes. Well, the expanded part of your question is, why does a fan film need to worry about liability, to spin off, fan groups in order to avoid liability? Well, this might be one reason why, because he's not supposed to sell that kind of merchandise anymore. And but fan groups can, apparently. I don't know. I mean, I don't know all the terms of the lawsuit settlement, but having these fan groups all of a sudden, promulgating the same products for sale that he was promoting before the lawsuit was settled raises some questions. When I asked Mike Bodden, Axanar's official spokesman, for an explanation for what was going on at DragonCon, his response, which he said came directly from Alec Peters, was that that table was being run by a completely independent organization with which he had no association anymore. Well, fine, if that's true, but the problem, of course, is that he appeared and posed for photographs at that table, behind the table, in front of the banner that had Tony Todd's photograph on it, and didn't say anything to them about, hey, why are you using these materials you're not supposed to be using of ours, as well as the fact that the domain name, axanarfangroup.com was reserved by Alec Peters back in May, as well as the fact that his Atlanta lawyer, Sheldon Friedman, reserved in Georgia's corporate or Secretary of State's office in their corporate database, reserved the name Axanar Fan Group. So it seems like there's still some connections between Axanar Productions, Alec Peters, and these so-called independent fan groups that aren't really that independent or don't seem to really demonstrate any real independence. And so with questions like that, I think it's important that that if there's going to be an actual legal separation between Alec Peters and Axanar Productions and these fan groups, it needs to be authentic, and it needs to be demonstrable, and it needs to be clear.
Yeah, and I think that all of these are distractions to distract us away from the fact that Alec through Mike Borden has said that the actual 2 15-minute productions are years away, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Mike Bodden told me, and I reported in Axe Monitor a few days ago. And, I think it's realistic. There's a huge steep hill that Axanar needs to climb in order to make those two 15-minute episodes, and to keep telling fans, oh, it's just a few months away, and those goalposts keep moving with every passing month, I think is disingenuous. It certainly raises questions and concerns, and I think Mike Bodden accurately reacted to the idea of how complicated it's going to be to promote those and create those two things, because it's still going to cost a couple $100,000. It's still going to take, cast and crew, and many of which are going to have to be volunteers. So he's going to have to find a way to actually assemble, to marshal these resources and produce these two things under the terms and the constraints of the settlement that he agreed to with CBS and Paramount. That's a big deal, and he still needs to raise that money. He can't do it through crowdfunding. Mike Bodden said up front, look, because of these constraints, it's going to be hard for us to get these things done, and it will take time. And he said it may take years.
At what point do you just give up and admit defeat and say that it can't be done and we overreached and sorry?
Well, that's a decision only Alec Peters can make, and it will mean admitting he's been wrong about something. And it will disappoint a lot of his ardent fans who've stuck by him, though not as many as there used to be. But it's important for him to keep fanning the flames of his own fandom in order to keep attention on both the Axanar project and his future projects, because his future projects will be able to crowdfund, and he needs to keep a connection with potential donors for that.
Does Axanar need to be a Star Trek fan production? Can it not be in its own universe with its own characters and ships?
Look, I mean, the reality is that, and I say this as a former fan film producer, when you file off the serial numbers, as it were, and try to promote something that's Star Trek without it being Star Trek, it just ends up feeling sort of empty. I mean, you lose a lot of your fan support because they want Star Trek. They don't want Star Trek Light. They don't want Star Trek sort of. They want Star Trek. They want to support fans' interpretation of Star Trek. So anyway, the reality is, and Alec has stated this himself in his deposition and in other statements that, and in emails that came out during the court case, that he knew the reason people were giving so much money to Axanar is because it was Star Trek, and that in one case he kept fanning those flames because he knew that if he took Star Trek away too soon, the label Star Trek away too soon, that he might lose out on getting people's donations to the project. So, he's aware, and every fan film that crowdfunds is aware of the fact that the Star Trek name brings in dollars for production, and and then that when you take that away, you're kind of on your own, and you don't have that foundation of canon and the emotional connection fans have with the intellectual property to buoy up your, to support your production. And, the folks at Renegades responded to the guidelines by doing that almost immediately, by taking away the Star Trek references in there. And, to their credit, that was great that they did that. But I think that, history will judge whether the Star Trek in all but name only approach really works. They have the benefit of having a lot of Star Trek alumni associated with it, and that may prove sufficient for them. But most fan films, especially under the new guidelines, are not going to have that to rely on. So, it's problematic to assume that if you just file off the serial numbers and promote your project as a non-Star Trek project, that the strength of the premise and the strength of the characters is going to be enough to carry the day. Because in fact, with most fan productions, and I say this again, having made them myself, they're just not going to stand up without the very firm foundation of canon to support your ideas.
Tommy Kraft learnt that lesson with what he hoped would be his second fan production that was morphed into an independent sci-fi production and didn't raise the money it needed to on crowdfunding to go ahead. So I definitely think that that's right, and I definitely think we're at the point now where it is going to be Star Trek Axanar, or excuse me, Axanar, a Star Trek fan production, in whatever form that takes at some point in the future. And unfortunately, I think that we're all heading down this path, and there's no getting off this path, for better or for worse, whichever side of the fence people sit on. And it is still a polarising issue.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
To be told that it's that the majority of fandom doesn't care about Axanar, do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, from the point of view that fan films and the larger fandom's interest in fan films has always been a niche within a niche within a niche. So, yeah, there are a lot of Star Trek fans who know next to nothing about Axanar and aren't emotionally invested in Axanar. But we know that there were, a couple, 15,000 or more people who were invested in it, literally, because they gave money to it. And that's not a small number. It's not a big number, when compared with all of the Star Treks that there are in the world, but it's a significant number, and obviously because Axanar was able to raise almost $2 million based on that kind of support. So, but the reality is that it's really not that big a deal, other than it has become this lightning rod for so many of the running kind of undercurrents of stress within Star Trek. And you see that around the upcoming Star Trek Discovery, and where so many Axanar supporters have basically, because they have a sour taste in their mouth from the lawsuit and from CBS, and I mean even go so far as to claim that Star Trek Discovery is copying Axanar in some way. And they just take pot shots at Discovery all the time, and that's not obviously true for every single Axanar supporter out there. But the very vocal ones are not fans of CBS, and therefore are not fans of Discovery, and so that continues to be this. This stake kind of driving, this wedge in between different parts of the fandom, because. And it's an amplification of what we've always seen with any kind of new Star Trek series, where you have the traditionalists who claim this is terrible, and it's not true to canon, and the Klingons don't look like that, and so forth. And we've seen that again and again and again with every new iteration of Star Trek. It's no different here. But what we do see that's different here is we have the already polarizing effect of Axanar that has just served to magnify that what's become now a normal kind of cycle of skepticism around new Star Trek projects into something that's if it doesn't affect a lot of people, it's at least very loud.
I think the biggest thing with Discovery now is that it's entering into a world full of social media, and everyone who has an opinion is going to be out there on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, and they're going to be making videos about what they don't like, and how you can't have bald Klingons, and you can't have Klingons with ridges, and dare I have a flashback to when I was 1 year old and Next Generation came out with a ridged four-headed Worf who's supposedly a Klingon. So there's all these things, and I think that's the biggest thing. But I want to put a big asterisk on all of this, on all of the Axanar coverage. It's been mentioned to me a few times that there are bigger issues in the world going on right now, and I freely admit that, and I admit that this is a small corner of life. But you run axamonitor.com, which is challenging Axanar's narrative. I run Trekzone.org, which is trying to bring an Aussie perspective on Star Trek, official and fan-based. So what we are seen to be doing online and publicly is this. So for some people to be saying, well, get a life, you need to be more concerned about what North Korea might be doing to the US, or for us here in Australia, it's the same-sex marriage equality debate that's going on at the moment. But that's not this website. That's not your website. Our website is about Star Trek, is about Axanar. And I think that for as long as Alec Peters is around making grandiose claims and failing to deliver, that will be here front and centre and countering his narrative. But sure. I will tell you what, Carlos, and I think you'll agree with me here. If he actually puts his foot down, gets his head down, and sticks his bum up in the air and produces Axanar 2 by 15-minute productions, as he said he is going to do, we will support him. Well, not necessarily support him, but we will definitely congratulate him on that effort and watch it with a skeptic's eye, but watch it nonetheless and say, well, hey, after all of this, he finally got in and got it done.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with the 2 Axanar episodes being made. You know, if he can do that within the limits that were imposed through the lawsuit settlement, then fantastic. If you can make your case to supporters for why they should give you another couple of $100,000 in order to make this, then great. You know, make that case. But you have to do it knowing that there's history behind it, and those supporters need to know what that history is, so that when they hand over that money, they're doing it knowingly, you know, with a full disclosure of what's come before in this project. And if he can do that, if he can navigate those waters, then great. You know, go ahead and do it. I certainly don't want to say I never want to see these Axanar things made. You know, I have skepticism just because as a film producer myself, there's, from a story perspective, from, you know, just a production logistical perspective, like I said, it's a very long and steep hill to climb, and if he manages to climb it, then that is an achievement on its own. But the best way to do that is to grapple with those obstacles in an authentic way and a real way, instead of trying to deflect all the time.
Well, Carlos, we're fast out of time. Thank you so much again for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, Matt.
And look, we're going to do this again sometime soon. I can just feel it.
I'm sure there's more news coming.